Good morning and welcome to another episode of What's Up with Power. We are happy to have you guys on here this morning. We've got another great episode lined up where we are going to talk all about the taper, preparing for race day, putting everything into perspective of all the buildup we've talked about with preparing your race plan, your training plan, and basically what do you want to do to make sure you are in awesome form for race day. And we've got Taylor Thomas from Thomas Endurance Coaching here to talk about that with us, and we will bring him on here in a moment. We've got the group rides queuing up in Zwift. We're about 1 minute away from having that group ride start, so I just want to give a little bit of a background on kind of the format for the show. We're going to have 15 minutes of teaching, approximately, maybe a little more, a little less, and then after that 15 minutes of teaching, we're going to have an open Q&A session, and that will go for up to 15 minutes, and that's how we'll go. So we've got another 35 seconds for the group ride to start in Zwift. If you haven't jumped on there already, go ahead and do so now. The group ride does allow a late start, actually, so if you show up a little bit after we start, you can still join us, but we are getting close to being underway. I'm going to bring Taylor on screen and hopefully have his slides and get the chat window out of the way so you see him and not there. So Taylor, how are you doing this morning? I'm doing great. So you can go ahead and I'm going to slide off the screen. It'll just be you and I will lead the group ride. So have at it. Taylor, hold on. I think I don't have your audio captured on the stream, and that would be a problem. Give me a second. See if I can fix that. Okay, talk again.
Hey guys, how are we?
Perfect. I think I've got.
All right, perfect. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about form, and so as a racer, as someone who's actively training, typically the primary goal is to be as prepared as possible for race day, and specifically for priority races. So we're going to talk about how we need to prepare and what we need to do to come into form, and how to make sure that we're doing our best to arrive at race day ready to rock and roll. So we'll dive right in. First slide, Justin, if you're not already there. What is form? So form is very simply your race readiness or your freshness for a race. So when we talk about form, we're talking about how prepared you are, and more specifically, how prepared the systems in your body are to produce race day efforts. So in theory, the goal is for your A priority race to elicit your best performances of the season leading up to that point. So we want to make sure that your body's ready to produce those efforts. And so that's what form is very generally when we talk about coming into form. The way that we track form is by a metric known as TSB, or training stress balance. Training stress balance is calculated by subtracting today's fatigue, which is acute training load, from today's fitness, which is chronic training load. So a lot of these metrics, or all of these metrics that I'll touch on and discuss, we've touched on in past episodes when we've talked about training with power, and we've talked about training plans, and we've talked about metrics. So hopefully you're familiar with what these are generally, but I'll delve in a little deeper. So form not only reflects your fatigue. So a lot of times when we think about form, we think about how tired we are or we aren't. but it also reflects our fitness. So it gives us a good insight into how fit we are, and we can tell what our fitness is doing by what our TSB looks like. So if we have a very negative TSB, which means we're carrying a fair amount of fatigue, we can also assume that we're actively training to produce higher fitness so that our CTL is on the rise. So it can be a little bit of a snapshot to see both the fatigue and the fitness side of the coin. And then lastly, it removes the guesswork from preparing for race day. So a lot of times athletes will go on feel. So they'll begin to prepare and to taper for race day, for a priority event, based on how they're feeling, and they'll make the decisions for off days, recovery days, and for specific types of training based on feel. What TSB does is allows us to apply a metrics-based approach to that feeling. And so it allows us to make sure that how we feel aligns with how we want to perform on race day. So it prescribes and assigns a number to that feeling. Next slide, Justin. All right, so how do we achieve form? Once we understand what form is, then we want to make sure that we achieve the ideal amount of it. Again, specifically for our goal events. So there is a range of TSB, or training stress balance, that's ideal coming into race day or showing up to race day to have, and that range lets us know that your body's prepared to produce the efforts necessary to get you where you want to be on race day. That range is +15 to +25. And the reason it's a range is because different athletes perform differently with varying amounts of stress, training stress or fatigue. So some athletes perform better with a little bit of fatigue. Some athletes need to be more rested, so they might be much closer or at that +25 mark. But finding that range, making sure to understand how you perform best and where in that range you need to be. And to that end, this is that 15 to 25 range is designed to reflect basically the morning of the race. So you wake up, you check your TSB, and that's the day that you should be in that 15 to 25 range, is when you're heading out the door to go to your race. So once we have an idea of what that range is, then we of course have to train and rest to elicit the responses necessary to put us in that range. So the key workouts in the months and the days leading up to our key event are going to be the critical pieces to pay attention to. The idea, of course, is that after you've done the bulk of your work and you've gotten your fitness where you'd like it to be, you feel like you're prepared for your race, then you begin your taper. So you begin to come into form, right? Which really just means that you're allowing your fatigue to drop, and you're allowing your form to be on the rise to begin to make your way towards that 15 to 25 range. Ideally, you want to have include workouts that keep your fitness high. Typically, we throw in or work in some efforts that mimic race day scenarios or efforts. So whether that's a criterium race or a road race, triathlon, whatever it is, we're starting to layer in some pieces to keep the legs fresh, keep fitness high, but starting to transition towards coming into form. Usually 10 to 14 days out is a good time period to begin your taper. Again, that's athlete dependent and depends on what exactly the race is that you're training for. But 10 to 14 days is a good place to So start to think about your taper. And usually the biggest reduction in terms of training that we see is in volume. So it's just in the sheer amount of hours that you spend training. We see a reduction in the volume of training, and that usually is what elicits that TSB rise or the start of the TSB rise. Acute training load, so ATL, is fatigue, right? So this is kind of the other side of the coin, or the partner to TSB. ATL is a weighted measurement of your daily fatigue based on the last 7 days of training. So ATL is a metric that we can look at, gives you a snapshot of your fatigue on a given day, taking into account the last week of training that you've done. So when you look at ATL and TSB side by side, again, the idea is that you can start to piece together how it is you're feeling, your preparedness for one of the key workouts that we talked about, and then ultimately how your taper is tracking. So ATL is important to pay attention to as well. And then, of course, not every race is a high priority race. So there's some races that we're using as tune-up races, using as opportunities to test fitness. So those, what we call B and C priority races, are approached differently than these A priority races, where we're talking about a full taper and coming into form. Low priority races, usually a TSB of -10 to 0 is a fine range for races that you're going to what we refer to as train through. So you're not necessarily looking to come into peak form. You don't want to be totally worn out. You want to have some freshness in the legs, but there's not a full rebuild after a B or a C priority race. And so lower priority races, you can keep your fatigue a little higher, keep your training stress balance a little more on the negative side, and push through those lower priority races to continue to move towards the higher priority races. Next slide. All right, so what do we do to keep track of these things, right? So we know what it is and we know how to achieve it, but how do we make sure that we're paying attention to the right numbers, the right charts, the right pieces of our training to make sure that we're actually accomplishing what it is we want to do. So the PMC, the performance management chart, we've talked about that a lot on past episodes of What's Up with Power. Performance management chart found in Training Peaks, and is a great way to track all of your critical kind of core metrics. So your training stress balance, your CTL, your fitness, your ATL, your acute training load, as well as things like TSS, peak performances. So PMC is a fantastic go-to chart for seeing how all of your core metrics kind of relate to one another, and what's happening if one is up or one is down, and how does that impact the other metrics, and potentially what do you need to do to elicit the correct responses in those metrics in terms of your actual training. So the PMC is really the first place to start on kind of a daily, weekly basis for you to check in and to look at what those key metrics are doing. Again, specifically as you start to map out and move towards a priority race in the taper. TSS, another great metric to use, training stress score, assigns a metric to how stressful a particular workout is or was. TSS really helps to guide your TSB as you move into your taper. So I mentioned volume is one of the big reductions that we see in terms of actual training load moving into the taper. Well, volume is directly responsible for an increase in TSS. Of course, intensity is in the mix as well, but just the duration of the training is one of the things that tends to rack up TSS very quickly. So keeping a handle on and keeping a watchful eye on TSS, the TSS of each workout, and then the cumulative TSS of each week as you move through the last few weeks into a priority race is really going to help you understand how TSB is impacted and what you can do to come into that ideal range. Of course, planning ahead, right? We want to make sure that your finger is on the pulse of your training and that you're doing everything you can to prepare as best as possible for whatever goal it is you have. So planning ahead, not just in terms of planning your race calendar, making sure you have workouts scheduled, but actually planning the details of those workouts, making sure that you set TSS and IF goals, IF being intensity factor, for each specific workout, and then using tools like the performance management chart to see how those predicted values impact your race day fitness, so your CTL, your race day fatigue, and then of course your form, your TSB. So taking some time to not only prescribe the actual effort, but understand what that effort is going to look like and how it's going to impact your build up and lead into a goal race is really going to help you keep your finger on the pulse of coming into form. And then to that end, the annual training plan, the ATP, obviously a longer term, more bird's eye view of a training year or a season, but using the ATP to establish target CTLs, so target fitness ranges for particular events. So whether it's an A, B, or C priority event, at the beginning of the season, you can go through and decide how fit you'd like to be for those particular events. And then you can also just decide and prescribe what weeks need to look like from a TSS basis. So how much training load and training stress you can handle to get you to those goal fitness numbers. So using the ATP, you can kind of backfill your historical information, your goals, and make sure that that again, from a bird's eye view, from a macro perspective, that your training is on track, at least generally, to get you moving in the right direction. So that's a great way to kind of start to provide some parameters generally for your training, and then using tools like the PMC, and then even more granular is to plan the TSS and IF amounts for your specific workouts, and that really gives you the full picture. Next slide. So what do we need to look for? There's a few things that we can look out for and kind of be aware of as our TSB. So stagnant. That means that your fitness is neither increasing nor decreasing. And that's not what we want, right? The goal is always be very methodical in how we increase our fitness or how we allow ourselves to rest. You know your fitness is stagnant when you're in a range of -10 to +10 TSB. And what that means is there's not enough fatigue to produce fitness gains, but there's also not enough rest for you to be in form for a priority event. So the only time you should really see that -10 to +10 is if you're coming off of a priority race, so you're in transition and you're resting, or if you're moving through that range your way to reaching that +15 to +25 TSB for a priority event. So just be on the lookout for that -10 to +10, and make sure basically that you're transitioning through that in your training to be on your way to being more fit or on your way to being more rested. So to that end, you can also be too rested, of course. You can be too fresh, and so too much TSB actually makes you not prepared and kind of too rested to produce race day efforts. Anything higher than positive 25 TSB is going to be cause for concern. That probably means that you're too rested, that you haven't been doing the workout necessary to keep the legs fresh, to keep things moving, to keep the fitness high, and there hasn't been enough training load and enough training stress to make sure that that your fitness and form are on track. So higher than 25, also something to look out for. Peak training, so there is a range to look for to know to understand if your fitness is moving in the right direction. Usually that's a TSB of -10 to -30. And so that range is important because when you're in the peak of your training, when training is very focused, that's where you should be in terms of your TSB. That lets us know that you're fatigued enough to produce CTL or fitness gains, but you're not so fatigued that we're risking burnout, overtraining, injury. So -10 to -30 is really the sweet spot, and you'd want to look for that just before you start your taper. So when training is at its highest, intensity is at its highest, volume is at its highest, that's going to be right before you begin your taper, and that's you want to be in that -10 to -30 range, and that would give you an idea and some insight into the fact that you're doing what's necessary to be prepared for race day, to produce those fitness gains, and then also be in a good spot to start that taper and be rested enough, but again, not too rested for your priority event. And then, of course, we also don't want to be too fatigued, right? So if there's such a thing as being too rested, of course, there's also such a thing as being too fatigued. A lot of athletes have been here at some point in their training. But I mentioned that the ideal range is -10 to -30 for peak training. Anything on the other side of -30 should be cause for concern. So if you see TSB numbers on the other side of -30 for prolonged periods of time, so anything more than say 3 days to a week, then that means that you're probably pushing yourself into a training deficit. And you're digging a bit of a hole that's going to be hard to get out of. It is okay to hit the other side of -30 if you're pushing through a peak training time, if you're pushing through a big training block, if you've just come off of some lower priority races where you produce some big efforts. You can touch on the other side of -30 as long as it's accompanied with appropriate amounts of rest and recovery. So you can touch on it and then make sure to recover, and then actively make sure to, or actively pay attention to the fact that shortly after you've hit anything over -30, you're actively trying to bring that TSB back into that -10 to -30 range. And that'll keep you from, again, making sure that that you don't touch on overtraining or get into that overtraining, burnout, and even injury zone. So a few things to pay attention there too. That wraps up form and how to come into form for priority events. I'll kick things back over to Justin. We'll take it to questions and answers, and I'll answer any questions you guys have for me. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor. We're open now for questions. If you've got any questions, let them fly in the Facebook comments. I will bring them out here and discuss them. A couple things I noticed from the presentation I wanted to maybe just focus on a little bit, and maybe just an anecdote of the way you put it. You mentioned, oh, and that one slipped my mind already. I was on the middle of this. Okay, the first one I know that comes to mind is we were talking about monitoring that TSB, wanting to know where it is, and how -30, you don't want to really be on the other side of it. And all this, I think, goes without being said, but it's all dependent on you having an accurate gauge on what your threshold training numbers are. So if you have pushed past your threshold significantly recently, it may be quite easy for you to push over minus 30 and not feel those gains. So if you're way over minus 30 and you're not feeling it, that's an indicator to say, you know what, I think we don't have things set up quite right, and I probably need to reevaluate what my threshold power is, my training numbers.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked about it in depth when we discussed, kind of training with power and how to start to do that, and I've touched on the accuracy or the legitimacy of your functional threshold power in pretty much every episode that I've done here. And to your point, it can't be overstated how everything that we talk about is hinged on or based on and built on the accuracy of the metrics that you're putting into these systems that we're using, right? So Training Peaks, WKO4, Best Bike Split, whatever tool you're using is only as accurate and is only as valuable as how solid and how sound the information you're putting into the system is. So yeah, if you're going and you're getting intensity TSS scores off the chart, your IF for workouts is really high, that leads us to think that you're at, you've pushed past that threshold. It's time to retest.
Or your power meter is not calibrated. That's the other one to think of.
Yeah, exactly. And that's when I begin to work with athletes, I take all their data on, I organize it, I analyze it, I go back and look at historical information, spend a great deal of time familiarizing myself with their past performances. And I would say 99% of the time, there's erroneous power data in there that they've been basing their training on. And it is from non-calibrated power meters. So in that, one bad power number reading can skew everything. So that can throw all of your metrics off. So yeah, properly calibrated power meters, appropriately set FTPs, and just being on the lookout for erroneous looking numbers, right? Having your finger on the pulse. I've talked about, constantly reviewing that data, not even on kind of the broad level that we've talked about, but, on a daily basis, uploading that right information, looking at what those numbers are, and then understanding if there needs to be adjustments made. And so, once you're kind of, you're into your training and you're invested in and paying attention to those numbers, then those things are usually pretty glaring.
Absolutely. All right, so I remembered the other item I wanted to embellish on a little bit, and that's where you talked about in the taper that we decrease volume, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what we look at. So putting that another way, what does that mean? We don't change intensity. So
right.
And we don't change intensity and we don't change frequency. So if you're working out 6 days a week or 4 days a week, keep that same rhythm going. Just choose shorter workouts or just take a few intervals off the end or whatever. So everything else should remain the same. You're just not spinning up the engine as much. You're just giving your body whatever that decrease is you need so it can recover faster. So
right. Yeah, and that's like I said, I mean, keeping those kind of race scenario or race mimicking efforts. So yeah, I mean, to your point about keeping intensity higher, typically we keep a certain amount of intensity through the taper to kind of continually or continue to familiarize or keep your body familiar with what those efforts are going to feel like. You don't just want to easy pedal through your taper, because when you show up on race day, your body's going to be in shock when it comes time to sprint or breakaway or bridge a gap or whatever it is. So yeah, decreasing that volume. And then also, like I said, the best way to understand what those workouts need to look like is to plan them in advance, specifically planning for TSS and IF numbers for those workouts, seeing what that's going to produce from a fatigue and from a training stress balance perspective, and mapping that out all the way through the taper. So you can kind of fill in the gaps and understand, okay, I'm 7 days out from my race. I'd like to produce or elicit, this response to my TSB. What does that workout need to look like from a training stress and from an intensity factor perspective? And that's kind of how you want to think about planning these tapers is again, kind of thinking about your broad goal and then filling in all of the details as you kind of backtrack through the taper.
Absolutely. And so one specific thing that might look like, let's say you've got a group ride you always do on Wednesday night and you're tapering for a Saturday event. Well, maybe the route and there's a perfect spot at about maybe 60 or 70% of the ride where you can cut back early and not necessarily hammer the rest of the way. So you hammer it for 60 or 70% with the guys, and then you basically take your cool down back. And that might be a really easy way to cut down your overall volume while still keeping the same intensity that you've been doing before. That's, a good way to look at it from an outdoor perspective. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's a lot easier inside. If you're doing indoor workouts, you just stop pedaling. You don't have to pick a turnaround spot, but and this, exactly like you said, it all comes down to planning that in advance and knowing, and you'll have, as you pay attention to your numbers, you'll have a good idea for how much TSS a given group ride, group race, whatever is going to do on your body. And so you can use that and adjust it. Okay, well, our time is up for the day. Taylor, thank you again so much for coming. We really enjoy your insights. You guys check him out. Thomas Endurance Coaching, at Endurance Coach on Twitter, thomasendurancecoaching.com, and Taylor at Thomas Endurance Coaching. Lots of great insights. If you have any follow-up questions for him, that's how you get a hold of him. We're here on the channel. If you've liked this content, please hit like, subscribe to us, share with your friends. We appreciate it a lot. We're here to help you guys take your training to the next level. So share it around. We really appreciate it. And also want to give a shout out to Training Peaks for their support of the show and offering a discount code to all viewers. If you use the code ODZ20 or ODZ20 at checkout, you can get 20% off Training Peaks premium services. So we talk a lot about different tools and services they offer. If that's something you decide to go and use, that'll help you out. Anyway, so we are glad to have you. Later on this afternoon, we got more content coming up at 3:30 Pacific with the skills and drills ride. We're going to learn all about the tactics for racing, attacking, and bridging. And we got Ian Murray heading that up. As well as every day, we got lots of great live content for cycling here on the show. So like us and subscribe, and we hope to see you again on the channel. So have a wonderful day.